Hi, folks. Welcome. Thanks for coming
Hey.
to our stream today. Hey. Let us know. We see all the comments on YouTube and stuff, so let us know where you're tuning in from. And also, if you have an open source software project, let us know in the comments what that project is. We would love to check that out. I know we've got a lot of developers tuning in today and contributors, but we also have a lot of software project maintainers tuning in. So this stream is part of GitHub's programs to support the open source ecosystem, but especially to support open source software maintainers. And as part of that, if you are a software maintainer, here we go. We have a community that you can apply to join. Come join us at maintainers.github.com. We'll post funding opportunities like this when the Sovereign Tech Agency opens a fund or anyone opens a fund. We'll post that there as well, so folks can ask questions and see what there is that they want to apply to. So let's see. Now let's do some quick intros. I'm Kara. I work on the open source programs team at GitHub, and it is my pleasure to introduce Felix, our moderator today. Felix, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Kara. So I'm Felix Reda. I'm the Director of Developer Policy here at GitHub, and our team works on basically advocating for open source software towards policymakers. So when it comes to laws, but also when it comes to setting up public funds, such as the Sovereign Tech Agency.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Let's see. Adriana, we've got you joining us from the Sovereign Tech Agency. Would you do a quick intro, let folks know about you?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm Adriana Groh. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the Sovereign Tech Agency, which is the home of the Sovereign Tech Fund and a newly founded organization, independent organization, but underneath the Ministry of Economic Affairs in the German government. Happy to be here.
Lovely. And we've got David here from Arch Linux.
Hi, yeah, I'm David, David Runge. I am a free software developer, mostly in freelance capacity by now. I'm currently working on the ALPM project, which is something that is SDA funded, which is awesome, and that I can spend my time on at this point in time. But generally, I've been working on Arch Linux related projects for since 2017-ish, I think. So that has been a while, but I guess we'll talk about that a bit more later.
Excellent. Okay, well, I'm going to pass things off, Felix, to talk with David a little bit about Arch Linux and your journey there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kara. So yeah, I think before we jump into exactly what the funding is about, it would be really helpful to hear from you, David, kind of what Arch Linux is, how you got involved in the first place, and also a bit to give us an idea of the size of the community behind it and how they work together.
Yeah, well, so I guess it's maybe good to understand that Arch Linux is, well, it's a Linux distribution that allows people to run a Linux system, basically. And it's quite opposite to some other distributions. It's community-based. So this means that there's no company backing it or something like that. You would see this typically like with places like Fedora or Ubuntu. They're basically company-backed to some degree or fully, depending. And so most of the stuff that happens in Arch Linux is basically driven by like people that are enthusiastic about building things and well, driving this community forward. And this distribution is kind of special because it has its own package management system that is separate from all the others, basically. So where on, I don't know, Ubuntu or Debian-based systems, basically, you have apt as the package management system, and on Fedora, so the Red Hat families, you have DNF, for instance. This is Pacman, basically, in our case. And so that comes with its own entire ecosystem, basically, of applications that you use for managing all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, I've never used Arch Linux myself. I've been kind of on Ubuntu at best. And the people who I know who have been using it are always super enthusiastic about it. So is that also how you got involved kind of on the development side of things? Did you like start out as a user and then kind of deepen your engagement, or?
Yeah, I guess my story is more like the user story, I would say, because I'm when I started using Arch Linux in the beginning, I think I was mostly interested in doing like pro audio things with it, or music programming, basically, because that was part of my faculty work, basically. And I just noticed that a lot of these packages, they were lacking or they were out of date, and that was due to people just not being available. So eventually I just started packaging all of these programs myself. And yeah, that's basically how you learn a lot as well, about different programming languages, about different build systems, etc. So it's like, yeah, it's like one of these entryways basically into the distribution, to really get into the community as well, but also to learn a lot. I think that was definitely like the driving force there for me, at least. So I became a packager back in like 2017, and then I also got involved with a set of projects that we have that circle around certain things like installation media and repository management, and now it's more like in the context of actual package management. So yeah, these things, they all need work, and as I mentioned earlier, it's not really like a company-backed situation or so. Most of the work is really happening on a day-to-day, whenever people have time basis, and yeah, that comes with all the downs and upsides, basically, that you have with that.
Yeah, and now that you're funded by the Sovereign Tech Agency, or going to be funded, I guess that's a pretty big step also in the development of the project. So how did you first learn about the Sovereign Tech Agency and end up applying there?
I had, like, in 2022, I think I tried to get funding actually for small scale projects. Back then I was mostly working on repository management software, because that direly needs an overhaul for the distribution. It's kind of old. I mean, most of the tech that we have is like 20-ish years old. So these projects really have grown over time. Sometimes not for the best, and sometimes they just have a lot of legacy, basically, and it's just the way it is. I think. So I was looking into like all the things available to me in Germany, such as Prototype Fund and LNet, and eventually also came across then SDF, which was kind of interesting, because the reasons are kind of different for an application, right? If you're looking at Prototype Fund or an LNet, this is mostly focused towards things that are new, or like adding new features to something in a way, and that's not necessarily always the case. Often you actually need to refactor things, you need to fix things, you need to change things while adhering to like old models, but you maybe need to rewrite it in a different language or something like that, and that often is not covered by these funds, sadly. So SDF was different there.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Adriana here. So having heard this about kind of the gap in the funding landscape when it comes to maintenance, is this like a typical story that you hear from a lot of your applicants, why they come to the Sovereign Tech Fund, or how does this compare to other projects that you fund?
No, definitely that's the story, and I think David already put it in very straightforward words, and I can just echo and add to it. I used to run the Prototype Fund, and I was also involved in hackathons and other innovation endeavors, let's say. But in reality, I must admit, I think we have a bit of an overemphasis on the innovation side, which is fun and exciting, and we want and need innovation, but it's also the truth and the reality that innovation and maintenance are two sides of the same coin. And if you want to produce new code, it oftentimes means working on existing code and fixing things there, adding things, but also sometimes even reducing code to make the infrastructure more reliable and secure and perform better. So all of this is nothing new, I think, for the developer community, but maybe it wasn't that much in the forefront for people who work with public money, public funds, and who design programs. So when we started working on a feasibility study for the Sovereign Tech Fund, we really emphasized this point that if we want to continue working with software in a way that it's participatory, transparent, secure, and it includes many different communities, we need to really invest in our common open digital infrastructure. And we really owe it to the open source community that has been doing this work for a long time with little to no recognition, providing the foundations and like a digital common good for industry, government, civil society, research alike. Really, like, yeah, the roads and bridges and whatever physical infrastructure reference you want to use. That is invisible for many, but it's absolutely vital and crucial. So with all of this in mind, we really said we're designing a program that is investing in our digital common infrastructure, which means open source software and the communities behind it. And we're going to start by doing this with a fund. The funding term is a bit misleading because we're actually contracting, which we decided to do because it's a very straightforward mechanism for many. So it's a contract where you design milestones and a timeline in the contracting process, and then the Sovereign Tech Fund is paying for the work that you're doing. And that can be a single developer, that can be a community, a foundation, can also be a company, really depends on what software component we're looking at and who's in the best position to do the work in the public interest. As I said, we're contracted ourselves and funded by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs, so it's public money we're using and putting it in public code. And we have this understanding that it's infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's a really unique perspective, and hopefully other countries around the world will take it as an example. And I'm sure many of the people watching live are involved in their own open source projects and will probably be thinking about, well, how can I apply? So we'll get to that a little bit later. Before that, I would just go a little bit deeper with you, David, now that you're going to be a recipient of the Sovereign Tech Agency's funding, what you're basically planning on doing, what this funding allows you to focus more on. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on within the context of Arch Linux?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we have different types of package management systems on these distributions. And in our case, it's Pacman that has been designed like over 20 years ago, basically, to deal with all of what we do on Arch Linux, basically, the package building, but also some tasks around it, at least to a rudimentary state, as in repository management and things like that. And some of these things, they've just been designed in such a way that they make it very hard to rely on them, because they are not really specified or defined in a clear way. They don't really follow like a specific version specification or anything like that. So a lot of the stuff is ad hoc, basically, and that makes it hard to actually rely on when you need to, for instance, get to metadata in a package file. It gets kind of hard to parse that reliably and really write that reliably as well. So this is something that we're currently working on to address, basically to improve this type of metadata specification, but also parsing of that, to make this more robust going forward. We have more ideas around services that is kind of outside of the scope of what I'm working on, where this particular thing is actually needed already, and we can't really rely on it. So we have to, for instance, use Bash to get to certain data in files, and it's not very pretty. And there are better ways to do this now, and also safer ways. So yeah, that's basically what we're trying to do. And well, we're also working towards improving like how we do cryptographic signature verification. We're at the moment relying on GPGME, which is basically a C library that wraps around GnuPG. GnuPG's GPG executable that is also extremely brittle and not so fun to use. We've had like lots of issues with it over the years with our own keyring, because we basically ship our packages with signatures that then the end user basically verifies on their system. And yeah, this is quite brittle due to the statefulness of GnuPG's approach, basically, but also due to now having like a split in that ecosystem. It's a longer story. I don't want to go into this one now, but it's basically an improvement over that. We want to move towards something that is stateless in this case, basically, to get around a type of like implementation detail or vendor lock-in in that case, actually.
Yeah, and how does it change the way that you collaborate? So did you have people who were able to kind of work on the project full-time in the past, or has it been largely volunteer work? Like, how is this going to change how you collaborate in the project?
I think like as a whole, Arch Linux is mostly, as I said, like volunteer driven, and there are a few people that have been able to, due to their work, do certain types of like packaging work, etc. But it hasn't been the case up until this year, actually, that people can work on topics in actual specific like funded capacity, and that definitely changes a lot the way you can plan, the way you can consecutively work on a certain topic. So you probably know this from any type of work. Basically, if you focus on something for an hour a day, it might work depending on the topic, but mostly if it's more complex, you will lose like the context, and then 2 days later you'll be like, oh, wait a second, I need to work into this topic again, and then you spend the same amount of time to kind of like make a very small amount of progress, and that is kind of frustrating if you're working on something that is a bit more complex, basically. And that has improved, I think, quite drastically, at least for these projects.
Yeah, and I can only imagine that kind of being taken out of your flow to have to work on something completely different all the time can be a big distraction. And I guess it's a large enough project that there's still going to be enough room for kind of volunteer contributors to come in. And if you want to say anything about that, like how people can get involved or something like that, also feel free to. And otherwise, we're gonna kind of go into the details of the funding.
Yeah. So I think for Arch we have the what can I do for Arch.archlinux, or what can I do .archlinux. No, what can I do for .archlinux.org, if I remember this correctly. This one basically outlines a bunch of projects that we have, for which we have maintainers that work on them. And there's a lot of like issues there to fix for sure. But also like the packaging itself, it's kind of I hope I got that link right. I will check.
We have it in I think we have it checked and it should
Nice.
show up on screen. Fantastic.
Packaging work is also it's a never-ending story. So if you're interested in that and have the sufficient amount of OCD, please join us.
Yeah. Thank you for the open invitation. So I would be curious to know, for other projects who might be thinking about applying, Adriana, how the collaboration works. You said a little bit about the fact that you're commissioning work, but yeah, kind of starting from the beginning. If somebody thinks, well, I think my project is digital infrastructure, people rely on it in business, in public sector, civil society, and here I am kind of maintaining this with a small team of volunteers. Like, yeah, how does it start? What does somebody need in order to apply? Like, what level of governance needs to be there so that you can support a project? Sorry,
Wrong picture.
I wasn't hearing you, but hopefully we have it fixed. Let's try again.
Still muted, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, you still cannot hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. The German in me that was like, jetzt, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, no, that must happen in every kind of situation call like this at least once. So I've done it now for us.
Especially when it's live.
So we have a platform where you can answer a couple of questions, and we really have this belief that we should internalize as much of the bureaucracy as possible, because of course we're working with public money and we're really aiming for bridging the requirements that must be in place when you're working with public money, but with what we're well aware of, the limited time and nerves, frankly, on the other end, because the people who we want to support are the experts to work and maintain on the technologies that are important, not people who are experts in drafting proposals for public funding. So that we're well aware of. So we're trying to keep it very short and crisp on your end, and internalize a lot of the processes internally, asking the questions that we really need the information for, and keep it crisp and short. However, we're very much still one of the only organizations that is doing the kind of work we're doing with the philosophy that we're having, which is investing public money in digital public infrastructure, meaning supporting the people behind very critical open source projects. And we have a high demand and still a very small team. We're only 2 years old. We're constantly growing, looking for people who want to work with us. Shameless plug, we're also hiring in the next few months, because we need more people who work with the proposals that we're getting, having conversations with the maintainers, because we're also not then just handing out a contract. We're having a conversation about what is the necessary work, how long will it take, how many people need to work on this, because of course you are the experts and we can understand and assess, but we're doing this contracting in a kind of dialogue with the people that are working on the code. So it does take some time. We're aiming at getting ever more efficient, faster, and less bureaucratic, but we're also in a learning stage here. But to answer your question, Felix, we're having this platform where you can tell us about the project you're maintaining, what kind of work you're doing, who you are, and then we'll come back to you. But we're also reaching out proactively. We also want to make sure that you don't need to know about us and you don't need to go to our website and answer those questions. It might also happen, especially as we're growing and getting better at this job, that we reach out to you in one way or another and we're like, hey, we're noticing this project and the important work that is happening, often by volunteer communities without any backup. And we would really like to support you in one way or another. And the most efficient or most straightforward is the fund, but we're also building up new programs and mechanisms that could also be of interest in the future for communities.
Mm-hmm. And since this is a German government fund, I think it's important to ask, do you have to be German to apply?
Good question. And no, you don't. That is very important. You don't have to be German. You don't have to be based in Germany. This is a global community working very decentralized on open infrastructure that is important for German government or startups just as much for any other organization out there, because it's a shared infrastructure, right? So we don't need you to be based in Germany or German or even German speaking. Everything works in English just as well.
That's definitely important to highlight. Yeah, so you touched upon the fact that the Sovereign Tech Agency doesn't just offer financial support. So I guess I'll pose the question to both of you, because I also don't know, David, if the Arch Linux project is getting also other types of support from the Sovereign Tech Agency, or otherwise Adriana could share a bit what this other type of support might look like.
I think generally that the most interesting thing about STA is actually that you have a person that is assigned to your project that is actually dedicated to you, to your project, to your work in a way, and that's nice. Hi, Mirko. So that is really, I think, a big plus. Makes it much more personal, I think. But other than that, I think we're mostly like focused on the project in this case, or I am. And as Adriana already pointed out, like the milestones, they're mostly defined by the project because they know usually what they need to work on. So that's a good point in autonomy, I guess, in that case. And yeah, there's not much more to it actually. It's pretty uncomplicated. I'm baffled myself.
I mean,
yeah,
that's great. But I think, Adriana, you mentioned you're also working on kind of other modes of support.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Just adding one sentence to David, it's like finding the balance between hands-off, like being hands-off and being supportive, and that's always depending a little bit on the individual case. But yeah, that's how we understand our work in the Sovereign Tech Fund, with a manager and the contract, how that's supposed, and that's what we want, how it can happen. But yes, we also are aware that, I say it in those very simple words, throwing money at a problem does not always solve the problem. And we think the problem here is the lack of support for the open source ecosystem in general. And that comes partly from a lack of awareness. It's not always clear for stakeholders how dependent they are on this often volunteer work that happens in the background, but it also sometimes doesn't happen because it worked fine so far, right? Like not even just fine, it worked great. And we might be reaching a point though now where the overuse and the under support or underfunding of the critical infrastructures is really coming closer to a breaking point. So just investing now in the structures we have in place, which is oftentimes volunteers, volunteer communities working on those projects, might not be enough. So we also need to think about structural change. So how can we increase awareness, and how can we really anchor more sustainable structures in different organizations to give back? We did a challenge, for instance, where we were asking exactly that question, like, how can we contribute back? How can that work? How can we improve documentation and like more mid to long-term support structures? We are also running a bug resilience program, which is focused on training people to avoid bugs as much as possible in the first place.
Is that
payout bounties?
Is that different from a bug bounty, or?
Yeah, it has like a 3-step, like not just a bounty, but before the bounty, we do training and best practice and skill sharing. Then we do the bounty, and then we also pay for the fixing, which I think is very important.
Like, also very important, yeah.
Exactly. It's a more holistic approach, I'd like to say, of a bug bounty program, and it's also focused on public interest. So what are like software we should look at that is really critical for many people, and not just in the interest of, let's say, one company. And quite new, we launched a fellowship program, and I would like to compare it to care work. Like care work keeps the world go round, but it's something that if it's done well, we don't really appreciate. If it's not done, suddenly everybody else is affected by it. So instead of commissioning work that is very specific, like a contract for a certain period of time for a certain technology, we want to give people who do lots of important jobs ongoing in the open source ecosystem an opportunity to work in a maybe more comfortable context where they are less maybe alone, maybe less in an insecure situation, maybe less dependent of having an hour here and 1.5 hours there, but like really fully focused for a longer period of time, working on very important software projects. And we have more ideas that are in the making, but that's what we're currently like running and building up.
And are fellowship applications also open at the moment, or when does that become available again?
Unfortunately, we just closed our first pilot round. So we are right now in conversations and selecting fellows with whom we have a very first round of sovereign tech fellowships. And we will then, with those learnings from the first, let's say, cohort, continue to run this fellowship program and probably have learned a few things already. So it will be an option again, but yeah, now we're in the first round.
That's great. Yeah, I really like this iterative process too of kind of running a pilot, seeing what works, what doesn't work. I remember kind of on the topic of bug bounties 10 years ago, when Heartbleed just happened, we started this open source security project with the European Commission. And at the time, it ended up being a bug bounty because that was the easiest with public tender rules to be able to basically pay a bug bounty platform to then pay out money to individual developers, because it's actually quite difficult to give public money directly to an individual. But yeah, we ran into exactly those problems around, well, what then happens with the bug that has been found? Is there somebody actually around to fix it? So it's great to see that you're kind of iterating on some of these established funding mechanisms and improving them. So now kind of turning to the question of kind of practically getting from a project that is without support to getting support. I would be curious to hear from you, David, what advice you would give kind of to other maintainers who are seeking funding. How would you start going about that?
Wow. Yeah, it's probably individual as much as the project is, but at the same time, as Adriana mentioned earlier, it seems very hard for programmers to write prose. So it's certainly something that that needs iterating, that needs help from outside often. So I think one of my biggest wow moments was just to kind of share like writing an application like that and to kind of flesh out like what is actually interesting about this project, why does it need funding, how do I explain this project to someone, to just drag someone from the outside into that process and then have them tell you like, hey, why do you explain it this way? It makes no sense, or this is way too complicated. No one needs to know about this complication, and it's often that what really helps, because then it gets way clearer, because you yourself you're kind of deep in the trenches of like working on that particular project, and you know about like all the specifics and the intricacies, and but then you lose track of like what does that actually mean to someone that would just pass by and look at it, you know. And that is, I think, a big takeaway for me, at least, writing project funding things. And that's has changed definitely how I write prose as well.
I think that's a really important point, because I would say on the other end, there are people who would like to get involved in open source projects, and they may not be super confident in their programming skills, but might have other skills like in writing prose or in design or project management and other things. So yeah, it's great to see also that these skills are needed in open source projects, and these are ways for people to get engaged. So yeah, on kind of staying on this topic of community engagement, is this also something, Adriana, that you look for when deciding to support a project, basically like what the community health is, or whether they have kind of processes in place to around things like diversity, transparency, things like that?
Yes, but also acknowledging that sometimes the case is that there is just one person, right, that is taking care of a really important software component, and then we're going to support that person, and that's what we think we have to do. So accepting the realities of what it might look like in some instances in some open source communities right now, and working with that, while also seeing where there can be gradual improvements and carefully like structural changes that also then of course lead to more sustainability, right? Like a more diverse community, better governance structures, a healthier environment to collaboration and working together, meaning also how much burden there is on volunteers, how well communication is working, and all of those things that are really, really important for the security of a software project, how successful it is, how much also it's enjoyable working on it, right? That's all very important. But we cannot like always have that in the first place, but we can have awareness for that, and then we can work towards it. And I think here again, the fund, the Sovereign Tech Fund, the commissioning of work is not always the best instrument, but maybe a fellowship, maybe a program to attract new talent, provide different formats where new people then, as you just said, also would develop the confidence to become part of a community, to become a maintainer themselves. That is what really pays off mid to long term. And that's why we're coming up with new, let's say, instruments under the Sovereign Tech Agency next to the Sovereign Tech Fund, why we're doing that work.
So I guess a project doesn't have to be perfect when it comes to governance, when it comes to diversity, but if they want to improve that, they can also kind of highlight that in their application.
Yeah, exactly. Like it is super important for us, but it's also not always possible in the reality. So we will gradually, with more capacity on our end, to provide support in that direction, more diversity and better governance structures and so on. Also make that a more hard criteria. But at the moment, we work with looking where it hurts the most, and then handing out contracts and taking it from there.
Yeah, I think it's great to see the Sovereign Tech Agency evolving, and I guess also the diversity of funds that is popping up, like you said, David, with things like the Prototype Fund. There are these funding instruments for projects that are just starting out. Then there's kind of maybe a middle stage. So for example, the GitHub Secure Open Source Fund, where the Sovereign Tech Agency is also an ecosystem partner, I think kind of falls into that category. It's projects that are growing really fast, that are suddenly attracting quite a lot of attention, but might not yet have the security practices in place and need funding, but also need education around secure software development practices. I can really encourage people to check out the GitHub Secure Open Source Fund. The applications for that are open until January 7. And this is kind of a combination of, on the one hand, funding, and on the other hand, education, mentorship, community around kind of learning the basics of secure software development and improving your cybersecurity posture. So yeah, I think not every project is going to need exactly the same kind of fund. So it's really encouraging to see that all of these different elements are popping up both within the Sovereign Tech Agency and also beyond that. Cool. I would then maybe see to make sure that we definitely have enough time for questions. I would maybe try to pop on over there. And if we run out of questions, we can also talk a little bit more about what the future has to bring.
So for folks who want to ask questions, throw them in the chat here on your platform of choice. And let's see, we've got a couple already. So we've got one here. Let's see. How secure is funding for the STA itself? So I'd love to hear some about how the STA itself is funded.
Yeah, sure. I guess this question is hinting a little bit at changing political landscapes in Germany as well. So we have a way earlier election than planned. That means that there's an interim budget in Germany that is also affecting everyone. However, the Sovereign Tech Agency has a contract with the Ministry of Economic Affairs. So we're operating under a longer time frame, and we're not dependent on a very quick decision that is very highly political. It's also, and I think that's a very nice sign, a project that has a lot of support in Germany across parties. So I think this is really highlighting that there's a growing understanding for open digital infrastructure as the foundations for not just our economies, but also our governments and our civil societies. And that is, like physical infrastructure, not something where we should wonder whether we need investments in it, but we should focus on how much and when and where exactly. So I think we're really working towards this understanding. As a modern society in 21st century, we're relying on software, which is open source software, to work in everyone's interest. And yes, so we're in a pretty secure position at the moment, and we're continuing working on making this like a new muscle for governments that we also don't see just in Germany as necessary, but really across democratic political systems, to see that as kind of a public service to work with for open digital infrastructure that is secure and available for everyone.
And I think that's really where the Sovereign Tech Agency has led the way in saying, we're funding projects regardless of where the maintainers are, regardless of where the projects are based. We're setting an example for institutions and governments around the world and saying it works. You're proving that it works. You're putting out the info. You're putting out the data. You're very transparent. And, now's the time for other governments to really take note.
Thank you. Yeah.
Classic commercial recusal question here. Does the STF have a recusal policy so the administrators invest in commercial projects won't be involved in decisions about open source projects, which might appear to compete with them?
I'm not 100%.
You can also just take this question in terms of what do you see, this is maybe very specific to the process, but do you see, I think they're getting at tensions between commercial interests, the bulk of large projects work is often done by developers at companies. How does that kind of play into this?
Yeah, that's why I was rereading the question again, so I'm going into the right direction. But maybe it's worth here explaining a little bit more that, although I think it's pretty clear from David's example, we're really looking at software that is in use, kind of across the board, horizontally cross-cutting different sectors, different communities, companies, groups of users, basically. So we can already tell how many people in which kind of sector, not in detail, but we can tell how many are depending on this software functioning. And there's little to no risk that it's benefiting one actor more than another if we're having this really infrastructure lens that we're applying, because it's so deep down in the ecosystem, to speak in simple terms, that it's benefiting a really diverse group of end users and other users who then build on top of this software component that we are investing in with the Sovereign Tech Fund. And I hope that answers the question. But that's how we're thinking about it. And that's also one of the criteria we have. You can see them on our website, the criteria, how we're deciding if this is a software project that we as the Sovereign Tech Fund, in this case, the Sovereign Tech Agency, as I said, is the roof, the fund is the investment vehicle. If this is a technology that we as the Sovereign Tech Fund with public money can invest in the public's interest, that we're really looking at those criteria.
So I guess kind of end user software is rather rare as a funding recipient, right? Where I guess these direct commercial competitions are more likely.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Exactly. So we, for instance, to make it a bit more concrete, we invested in Activity Pub to then have many like Mastodon and others, many that can profit from a better software that they build upon, and that's why we looked at Activity Pub in that case.
This person's wondering if paid metrics, like, is that based on time or tasks? So when you're working with someone and paying them out through the fund, how does that work?
There are different contracts. Most of them are milestone contracts because that's very straightforward and works well for most of the people we're working with. There are also time-based contracts. That really also depends on the conversation we have with the people who we're commissioning work with. It's not something that we as the Sovereign Tech Fund say we're only doing it this way. That depends on the individual case.
Lovely. Any other questions that folks want to throw in the chat? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Great one. Is there any sign or progress for any other government to set up an institution similar to the Sovereign Tech Agency?
So we are currently involved in a couple of conversations. Maybe one that I find very promising and that is pretty much evolved is on the European level. There's a new legal instrument, let's call it, which is called a European Digital Infrastructure Consortium, where different European member states try to join forces and set up joint programs that were started by one member, for instance, but then could be scaled up and accelerated by working together. In our case, that's with the French, Dutch, and Estonian governments involved here, and we're hoping that as you said it, we can provide an example, Kara, and then share our learnings and maybe like share a blueprint that can be picked up by others. So that's not the only stakeholders or potential partners we're talking with. We're lucky to have a keynote at the UN just this summer at their open source program office summit, where we're really sharing what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're doing it, and always reaching out a hand for other governments, or also not just governments, other stakeholders.
Yeah, I was at that event in New York at the United Nations this summer, and it was really amazing to see kind of how proud the German government was of showcasing the Sovereign Tech Agency. I guess Germany is not necessarily known around the world for forward-looking digital policy. Like sometimes people make fun of the number of fax machines and public administrations and things like that. But in this case, the reception was really so positive, and people from, governments all over the world kind of pointing at this as an example of really good digital governance. And I think it's such a no-brainer for the European Union to set up something like this, and GitHub is definitely a big advocate for that idea. The EU has kind of this long-term budget planning over something like 6-7 years in the future, And it would make so much sense to set up a European sovereign tech agency or something like that. I mean, when we look back at when the idea for the sovereign tech fund was developed, it was part of the fact that the Trump administration at the time was trying to defund the Open Technology Fund in the US. And open source activists in the US were very concerned about it, also talking to us open source activists in Europe about it, like, hey, let's write a petition, let's write letters. And ultimately all that activism was successful, and the Open Technology Fund in the US exists to this day. But it really also, I think, highlighted that us Europeans shouldn't just rely on somebody else to pick up the tab for open source funding.
Let's see, we've got, are there plans to widen the criterion to include non-critical open source digital infrastructure?
Well, currently we're working on expanding the organization itself so it can serve the very great need we can see in the communities as it is. But the idea to look at the real foundations of the ecosystem and invest in, I always put it in the very simple terms, especially if I'm talking to political stakeholders, the software that the software developers need to develop software, which is per se critical, right? Because that's if it's breaking away, we are all running into the problem scales pretty much through the whole ecosystem. And I'm getting tired of bringing it up, but sometimes I even joke that we didn't use many words. We just printed out the XKCD comic dependency and showed it to people, and we're like, this is a problem. And it really, it's simplified, of course, but it really worked. So at the moment, we're really focusing on the critical little stick right on the bottom right, as it like in the comic. And when we're in a confident place of having enough stakeholders on board, having the resources needed, having not just short-term but also mid to long-term effects, then of course we can look ahead. But we take it step by step, or like iterative processes, like Felix put it.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that this XKCD comic really has done so much heavy lifting in the open source space.
Yeah, very true.
We shouldn't rely just on that. So I think the research part is also really interesting. Could you say a little bit about that? Because I mean, at GitHub, we've been doing a bit of research into like how do companies fund open source, just to be able to put some numbers to that, and to show also to policymakers like that there is already quite a lot happening, but it could be a lot more focused if there was more maybe co-financing between the public and private sector. And I know that the Sovereign Tech Agency also does research. So that would also be interesting, like how that can contribute to a healthy open source landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So even if we're building up more and more instruments in like under the Sovereign Tech Agency next to the fund, it's like a potpourri, like a puzzle that needs to fall into place. So the research is a big aspect, and I think there are other actors and more things coming out right at the moment that are really helping to increase the knowledge and also the arguments at hand, quite frankly. Like there's been a survey by the Harvard Business School recently. Then there's the Digital Infrastructure Insights Fund, which is a collective of funders that is producing more and more insights around digital infrastructure. And in the Sovereign Tech Agency, we are looking into metrics, how to measure the impact of our investments mostly, because we do qualitative assessments, right? Like we talk to the people that we're working with, who we're commissioning work with, but we also want to have quantitative analysis in place to, have the arguments and demonstrate why it's important. The European Commission released a survey, I think, back in 2017. Also around the investments in open source in general. So there are really good actors out there that are producing knowledge, and we're now also trying to add to that knowledge. And I think we need all of it to make it more visible, because in the end, if we're talking among developer communities, I think the argument is oftentimes super clear, but we don't need to only talk to them, and also not only to the IT departments in big companies, but they also need to make it more clear to their mid management level or senior management level why this is actually important, and why, yes, maybe it did also, like, it did work out the whole time, but that does not mean we can rely on it and should continue like that forever. I think that's the tricky part where we need the good arguments for.
Are companies able to funnel support to open source through the STA?
We're actually working on that right now, because we want to not just advocate for companies also contributing back more and maybe in better ways, but also think about how we can tackle this, let's call it, tragedy of the commons we see here. Like, right, why should I as a company invest in this component if all my competitors also use it? That comes back to the question, like, if is competitiveness an issue here? Well, everyone relies on it. That makes the incentive for individual players to pay for it less but it also makes it unlikely that everyone is doing it at the same time, right? So we have a bit of a puzzle here, but maybe the Sovereign Tech Agency could be a home where we say, okay, we have processes in place, and we have experts and structures, and we also experience maybe in working with the communities, so we could maybe provide the pooling and then distribution in a way that it's beneficial for everyone, instead of having many different little actors, or not so little, but everyone's doing it from their own perspective. And that might even be a risk for the ecosystem, because then we're not coordinated, that everyone is just looking from that one angle, and that might increase pressure and even add stress to the community. And we don't want that. Like, not just throwing money and it won't solve all problems. Sometimes it can even lead to more, and we should definitely avoid that trap.
The thing that made me, the thing that made me believe, I think, most strongly in the STA's approach was in 2023, when a lot of companies cut budgets. We saw a lot of open source funding go pretty steeply downhill. It really proved that this kind of piecemeal from companies wasn't a sustainable approach, that it was very vulnerable, and we needed less vulnerable sources of support.
And we're also very glad that with the Secure Open Source Fund at GitHub, we're able to rely on the SDA's expertise. I mean, this is also an idea of pooling funding from multiple companies and then bringing in ecosystem partners such as the SDA to help us build the programming around it. And I think, that makes a lot more sense than every company kind of going at it alone, and probably leaving a lot of gaps in the meantime. So before we wrap up, I would welcome some kind of final words from each of you. Adriana, you should definitely cover where people can go to apply. Is there a deadline, anything like that, and anything else either of you would like to share?
Well, yeah, I can start, and it's a team effort. So it's really great that we're having this conversation, that we're working on a joint mission together, and that we're also doing that in this this format where we really have the conversations, right? It's not top down. Okay, now we're going to invest, and then that's it. But it's really like with communities and for the communities. And yes, you can go to our website. I think it's in the notes, and learn more about our programs. There are no deadlines for the Sovereign Tech Fund, but as I said, demand is really high. So just for expectation management, we're right now really doing our best to come back to everyone who's applying, while also reaching out to people who don't even know that we are existing, and getting the word out there of our work, while increasing our funds ourselves. So It's just the start, though, that I'm sure about, and I'm pretty positive that we will see more of this work, not just from us, but from others in the future, together with like GitHub, for example.
Yeah, and David, any final words of encouragement to other maintainers?
Whoa, yeah. I think it's always good to remember that people are basically the experts in their field in a way. And I think often when you've worked long on a particular topic, you don't really feel that anymore. You don't really understand that maybe you're the only person that works on this topic or has been for like 10 years. And that's kind of scary. Like looking at it from a package maintainer point of view, I've seen many projects that are basically dead in the water and that everyone relies on. And yeah, I would love to see many of these be improved. That would be very cool for the future because yeah, it makes life better for everyone involved basically. So in case you need more input on potential projects to fund, let me know. I think we have an internal list of many projects that we could share, no problem. Yeah, but in general, yeah, do apply and find a good scope for the work to be done. I think it helps also to raise the the awareness of that there is this project that is needed by many other projects or people, and that it needs to be improved. It's very important part of it as well, I think.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Felix, for leading this. Thanks, Adriana and David, for joining us. For those who are watching this stream after the fact, you can check out any of these links and get more info. And please, if you are an open source software maintainer, come join us in the maintainer community at maintainers.github.com. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.